Okay, so this is pretty kind of informal. It's sort of like uh, had some feedback that some people still kind of wanted like a review on relationships, sort of like the stuff that we already went over, but just maybe review it and talk about it amongst ourselves so that maybe if there's some holes in our understanding, we can kind of figure that out and make things clear. So a lot of this information is taken directly from the Rails documentation. And if you ever have a question, I would just go to that URL. So that's looks the Rails guys looks something like this, and it's on Active Record associations. And pretty much anything that you can think about, like, oh, how do I do that? You can find it on this page. Figure out from this page. Okay, so yeah, so we have relationships, and then we're gonna sort of talk about the different types of relationships that belongs to. Has one, has many through, has one through, has and belongs to many. So those are all the associations that we have in Rails. In class, we really only went over belongs to, has many through. And we didn't really go over has one through, or has and belongs to many. The reason for that is because you can pretty much do everything with the other ones that we talked about. And the other ones are not really used that much. Any questions on that? All right, so again, this is just sort of review. So I'm gonna kind of go fast through it, but if you have any questions, just stop me and want to talk about something specific. So if you remember belongs to, this is how we look on the database side. So we have two tables. Here we have the books table and then the authors table. And then each of these tables has a key, which is the ID, right? Remember that the ID is the key for each table. And the key is kind of like the social security number of the row in that table, which is unique and it identifies that particular row. So for example, for the authors table, if you have the author is Bob, the ID for that author may be 1, right? And then for the books table, you also have a key, which is the column is ID, but we have another column called a foreign key, which is author ID. And it's called a foreign key because the value of that is really referencing the key in another table, right? So it's foreign to that table. It's not in that. It's not a key in that table. It's a key in another table. So this is the database structure for belongs to. So author ID, each book belongs to one author, right? And so that's why we have this column right here, author ID. Questions on that? So then in Ruby, so now that's the structure of our database. Then over here we have how we describe that that's happening in Ruby. Just remember that we have the database world and we have the Ruby world. The database world doesn't know anything about Ruby. So the database world is just kind of like doing its database thing. But in the Ruby world, we need to tell Ruby how things are structured in the database. So here is how we're telling Ruby that we have that kind of structure in the database. So here we have the class book that extends from application record. And we're specifying inside the class that we have a relationship to author. And so we write belongs _ to author. And that tells Ruby that that relationship exists. Pretty straightforward, right? Questions? Yep.
For spacing that belongs to, are we technically supposed to have spaces in between there? Or is that?
Oh, like between here and here?
No, like belongs to an author.
Yeah, there's a space there. Maybe it's
fill after the colon.
Yeah, right here. Between the to and the author. Yep. So this is a method. Like belongs to is a method that was written by the Rails people, and we're passing it a symbol. So we could, theoretically put parentheses around it, and like a normal method call.
Symbols. Because the colons look really weird if you're not used to symbols.
Yeah.
But yeah, so putting a colon in front of a word like that is what makes it a symbol, which is a special data type in Ruby.
Okay.
So like you can have an integer, you can have a string, you can have a symbol. And so that's why that colon looks so weird, because intuitively you want to put belongs to colon space author instead of the other way around. So yeah, I get that looks really weird, but yeah, it's in Rails everywhere, because symbols, basically their advantage is that they're really fast to access.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a bunch of strings that all are all blob,
Mm-hmm.
Ruby saves those all as different instances of blob. So they're not all pointing to exactly the same thing, but symbols do. So if you have a symbol named blob, it always points to the same spot in memory.
Okay.
And so it can access it really, really fast. And so that's why you see so many symbols in Rails and in Ruby.
Yeah.
So colon author is pointing to a symbol, and so yes, belongs to space colon author.
Yeah. And you could, let me see, maybe do something like belongs to, and then author. Like we kind of understand what that is doing. It's calling the method and then passing it a string, right? So instead of passing it a string, we pass it a symbol. It would look like that, right? And the symbol, yeah, like Layla said, the symbol is, instead of putting quotes around it to specify that it's a string, we put a colon in front of it. And then in Ruby, you can remove the parentheses. And so then it starts to look something like that. Good question. Anyone else? Question?
I guess maybe it'll be answered in the next slide, because I'm wondering how you connect so you connect here, it belongs to the author, books belongs to author.
Mm-hmm.
Will there be an author belongs to book?
Has many.
Yes.
Yeah, it's because this is a one-to-many relationship. So the belongs to is describing one side of the relationship. So here we have two tables, right? And so this is one relationship. It's a one-to-many relationship, or you can say a many-to-one relationship, right? So but the two tables together are the relationship. And then the belongs to is describing, okay, which side of the relationship is book in. Okay? So book is in the many side of the relationship. And that's the belongs to saying, I belong to one author. And so then that's how you can think of it, as this is on the many side because I'm on the many to one author. Yeah. And then we have the migration, right? So the migration tells us how we create this database structure. So then the migration here is combined in the same migration. For the two tables are in the same migration. So that's something that you can do, right? So here we have a create table authors, and then we have a string name, timestamps, and then we have another create table books. You can see that we haven't used this before. We can do t belongs _to, and then we write author, and then index true. So in the past, I think we've written t.integer, and then we will write author ID. Right? So the book would have an author ID column, but you can also use this helper that Rails wrote for us. That when you write belongs to in the migration, Rails automatically says, okay, I'm just going to add underscore ID to this. And so it's in reality, it's going to create a column called author ID. And then it's going to also put an index in that column. And in a database, what an index means is that the database can easily find and easily search by that column. It does something special where it saves some extra data so that its searches on that column are faster than what they would otherwise be. So that's the migration from creating that structure. Questions?
Is that similar to, because like we get feedback in our app to do key dot references and then the foreign key, is that kind of the same thing?
Yep. Yeah, that's the same thing.
Okay.
And then, yeah, here in this example, they didn't add the foreign key, which is good practice to just do. And the foreign key just, when you add something to, if you were adding something to the books table, it would check that author ID is in the authors table. And if it's not, it should give you an error. Yeah.
So would you write this when you're first writing your database table, or would you put that information in the model?
This is in your migration. So this is the migrations. Remember, the migrations specify how the database looks, right? So you're writing Ruby code that when it gets run, it's going to be creating these tables in the database. Once this code runs, then it's not going to be running all the time. It should probably never run again. It's only going to be running when you create the database. And so they'll probably, like if you're creating this migration, it'll run once in your code, and then it would add that table to your local database. And then when you commit it, and then somebody else downloads this code, they run it, and then it would create that table in their database. But then once that happens, then we don't really go back to this code and run it again.
So then would it be best practice to also add a foreign key, or is the belongs to enough preferred?
Yeah, you want to add a foreign key. So I think like Marcus mentioned, this is from the Rails guide. So if you see this in the Rails guide, you'll see that they write belongs to, but I think most people that I've seen, they do like references instead of belongs to. You can write t.references author, and then you would write a foreign key true, and then that creates the foreign key. And so you're specifying how the database table is going to look. Any other questions? Okay. Right, so that's kind of like how I like to think about it is, I try to picture this model in my head. Okay, that's how the database would look like. And then that's how I specify one side of that relationship. And then that's how I would specify the migration. And then once you get into this pattern of I know what the relationship should be. How do I do that in Ruby? And then how do I do that in the database, right? Because you want to do it in Ruby and you also want to do it in the database. This migration code, it's only going to run once to create your table, and then that's it. But this Ruby code is going to continue running every time you start your app. This code is going to run, and you're going to have access to that. Questions? Okay. So then this is the opposite side of the migration, right? So we still have the same tables. So it's the same relationship. But now instead of going from books to authors, we're going to go from authors to books. So here we have an author, and then each author could have multiple books, right? And it could have multiple books because each of those books that author owns have an author ID of that author. So these are the same tables, but now we're looking at it from the other side. We were looking at it from the many to one. Now we're going to be looking at it from one to many. Right? And so then to specify that on the Ruby side, we would do a has many books on the author table. So we're still talking about the same two models, books and author, but in the book model, we write belongs to, and then in the author model, we write has many. And so now we have the association on both models. We have a belongs to and a has many. And typically that's what you would do, is that you have two models. In one model, you have belongs to, and in the other model, you would have has many. Questions? Okay. So then the migration is just the same for has many, right? Except that now we would be focusing on this table, the authors table. And that table really has no information about the books, right? Then the table that has the information about the author is the books table. Yeah.
Could you theoretically make as many tables as you wanted to in one migration, like in one migration file?
You could in theory, yeah.
Is that like not a good practice? Like what's best practice on that?
Yeah, it's not a good practice, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the best practice is to run the command that generates the migration, like Rails G model, and then that generates one migration for one table.
You
Yeah.
technically want to do that on two migrations.
Yep. Uh-huh.
Okay, so if you're doing it that way, you have to actually do all of it by hand.
Say that again?
So if you were doing it that way, you
Oh.
could do it all by hand?
Yeah. Uh-huh. You would be adding this. You could generate one migration.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like just a plain migration, and then go in and add this code inside that migration. Yeah, but I guess in theory, your entire database could be in one migration.
You want to do it one table per migration.
Yeah. Yeah, any other questions?
Why is that? Well, I can probably think of reasons, but why would that be a bad practice?
I think it's because then I guess first is it would be more difficult to find that migration file. It's like if here the name of the migration is create books, right? And so like if you were like, oh, I need to change something on the migration that creates the authors, like, where do I find it? So it's a little bit more difficult to find it. And so mentally, like if we go by the rule that one migration, one table, then it makes it just obvious for everyone working on the project where the files are. And so it may not seem like it takes much to find the files, but when you're working and you're thinking about something else, it's just easier if there's like a conventional, this is how everyone's doing it. Any other questions? All right, so now, like why do we add the belongs to and the has many? So for the belongs to is because if we load a book from the database, right? So here on the first line, I'm loading this book from the database using the find by method. Here I'm loading the book that has the name Lord of the Rings. And then I can use that. Once I load that, I don't need to do another find by to load the author of that book. Right? I can just do book.author, and the author, I got that method by specifying the relation, the association in Ruby. And then I can do book.author.name, and that evaluates to the name of the author of that book. Because first, when I do book, that's referring to this book that I just loaded. Then author loads the author from the database for that book. And then on that, author, I do name, and then that should be the string, which is the name of the author. Right? So that's how you would use it. Yeah, questions? Makes sense? All right, and then how to use the has many. So with has many, you have access to the children. You can find the children, and then you can create children. So for example, right here, I'm loading an author. And then I want to know how many authors that, or how many books that author has. So if I do author.books loads all the books for that author. And this books method came from adding the has many association. And so if I do author.books.length, then that gives me how many books that author has, because books call it active record relation, but it behaves very similar to an array. So I can do the length on that object. And I could iterate that array, just like well, it's not an array, but I could think of it like an array and iterate it. And then I could go through each of the books of that author. So that's accessing the books for a particular author. I could also do a find by just on the books of that author. So I can do author.books.findby, and then I can give it a name. So instead of doing this, what I would have to do is book.findby name, and then comma, author ID, and then something else, right? So this, when I do books.findby, that limits my search to just the books for that particular author. Questions? You could also add the where right here, so you don't have to limit yourself to find by. So if you did author.books.where, and then you can do add anything that you would like to search, and that just searches for the books that author owns. And then we also can have the create method. So book equals author.books.create, and then we pass it a name. So this is going to create a new book that is owned by that author. And you see that right here, I'm not adding author ID. That's because when I do it on books, author.books, that automatically adds the author ID. So that's like a little shortcut. And that also, makes it so that we are sure that that book that we are creating has that particular author ID. So those are kind of like shortcuts that you can use. Make sense? Any questions? Okay. All right, so then the next association is the has that we're going to talk about is the has many through database, has many through. So in the database structure looks like this, right? So now with a one-to-many relationship, we have two tables, but with a many-to-many relationship, we need three tables to represent that in a relationship, in a relational database. We need three tables. So in this particular case, we have physicians, we have appointments, and we have patients. And so in appointments, we have a physician ID and a patient ID, and we also have an appointment date. And so the one physician can have many appointments, right? And then one patient can have many appointments as well. So many-to-many relationships are made up of two one-to-many relationships. So right here we have between patients and appointments, we have a one-to-many relationship because one patient can have many appointments. And between physicians and appointments, we have a one-to-many relationship as well. because one physician can have many appointments. And so those two one-to-many relationships make a many-to-many relationship, because multiple patients can have multiple physicians, right? So one particular patient can have many physicians through appointments, and then one physician can have multiple patients. That would be like, if I'm a patient, I have seen multiple doctors, because I had appointments with multiple doctors, and then that's where the relationship would go through. If I'm a physician and I've seen multiple patients, so that means that I had appointments with multiple patients. That would also be stored here. Right? Any questions? Yeah.
So whenever you have a has many, do you need to also have a through? Is that just...
Well, the through is just a Ruby thing. So the many-to-many relationship, so this diagram is just representing in the database world what it would look like. Once we go into the Ruby world, you could still have this structure, but you might not specify to Ruby that there's a many-to-many relationship there. So you might not specify that it has many through. So these calls that you make in Ruby, you're not trying to tell Ruby all the possible relationships that exist in your database. You're more concerned with adding them if they're going to be useful to you, if they're going to save you time. Because we could have another table that, like maybe over here, like hospitals, and then, I don't know, we might not need to go from appointments to hospitals. That might not be something that we want to do in our app, but that relationship might exist. Any other questions? Okay, so then now we want to specify in Ruby, how do we, this is what it would look like in the database, right? So now how do we tell Ruby that that's what's happening? And so again, with a many-to-many relationship, we build it out of two one-to-many relationships, right? So that's what we have in the appointment table. We have the belongs to physician, because that's one side of the one-to-many relationship. It belongs to physician. And then in the physician class, we have the has many appointments. So these two together, has many appointments and belongs to physician, they specify a one-to-many relationship. Okay? The one is the physician, and the many is the appointment. And then similarly, we can specify the same one-to-many relationship between appointment and patient. So we write belongs to patient, and then the patient has many appointments. And so the one is the patient, and the many is the appointment. So that's just a normal one-to-many relationship. And then to specify the many-to-many relationship, then we write a has many patients. Well, let's look at physician first. We have has many patients through appointments. So what this is, one way that you can think about this is that we're saying, okay, from a physician, we can get to patients through the table appointments. So we need that table appointments to know which patients will correspond to a particular physician. And then in the other side, the patient, you can also add the same thing, has many physicians through appointments. So now, and it's symmetric, right? Like one patient, we can get many physicians from that patient. or we can get many patients from that physician. But they are both using the appointment table to get to the other one. That's why it's called through, because you're getting to a third table by going through this, what we call the join table. Any questions? Good.
So will there be any instances in many-to-many relationship where we don't deal through appointments like that? Will there be any instance?
Yeah, I mean, if you're thinking about like, oh, I'm going to be using, I want that concept of the many-to-many relationship. I want to use it in Ruby. Then yeah, you would need to write this. There's another association. There's the has and belongs to many. So you could use that instead. That one I think is not as used as the has many through. Yeah, so I guess we can talk about that one. So right here, you can see that in this many-to-many relationship, we have 3 models, right? 3 classes. And we're saying through appointments. Through appointments, remember that I said like we're going through a third table. What's actually going on in Ruby is that we're actually going through a model, and then that model represents a table, and that's why we're going through a table. With the other association, the has and belongs to many, that one in Ruby, you don't need another model. You still need 3 tables, but you don't need to have 3 models. You can just have 2 models. And so, some people use that if you only have in your table, let's say that your appointments table, we only had physician ID and patient ID, and we didn't have an appointment date, then we can just use has many and has and belongs to many association. But anytime that you want some extra data in your join table, then you're going to need 3 models. So a lot of people just start with a has many through, because maybe you might need to add some data to the join table at some point. Yeah.
But the joint table is just practically keeping a record, right? Or
A record, yeah, it's keeping a record of the relationship. Yeah. Yeah, if we go back to this table, there's a table that's keeping a record with the relationship as well. Which table is keeping a record?
books.
Yep. So books is keeping a record of the relationship. And then over here, now appointments is keeping a record of the one-to-many relationship here, and also keeping a record of the one-to-many relationship here. And then that makes it so that this is keeping a record of the entire relationship.
Question we may be getting to. So something else we have in one of our tables is a dependent destroy, and don't recall why we have that in there.
Yeah, so let's go to the other one. So let's say that for some reason we wanted to delete an author. Let's say that we delete the author, and then all the books that author had, if they stay in the database, now we don't have an author for those books, right? So then we would load the book. It would say like author 7. We would try to look for author 7, and it's not in the database, right? So that we say that the data is inconsistent now, right? Because it's pointing to author 7, but author 7 is not there. So what dependent destroy does is that when you delete the author, it also deletes all the books in that association,
Gotcha.
so that the data is kept consistent. Make sense? All right, any other questions? All right, so then, that's how we specify the has many through relationship, and then that's how we would create that's the migration. So that's how we would create the tables. And again, we would put each table creation in its own migration, but this is so we can see it all together. So this is creating the physicians table and the patients table, and then this is the appointments table. Yeah.
So the index equals true. We could just a little bit clearer.
Yeah. So when you have a database and the database is searching on let's say it's searching a particular column. So let's say that it's searching on physician ID. It has to go. The database has to look at everything. Basically, okay, does this row have index ID 5? No. Then it looks at the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one. If you have hundreds of patients, that's going to be still pretty fast because the computer can just go through all that information very quickly. But if you start to have like lots, thousands, maybe of appointments, then that's going to start to take longer and longer, right? The more rows you have in your table, the longer it's going to take for the database to look through each row for that value. And so what an index does is that think about it like like a book index, right? So like if you have a textbook and you go to the index and you look for like some medical term, like eye or something, it'll tell you eye exists in page 7, 20, 23, and so on. And so instead of like searching the entire book where it's talking about eye, you can just go to the index and then find all the instances where it talks about eye. And so that concept also exists in database. So database have that. And so when you put an index on a particular column, then the database doesn't have to search every row for that value. It creates like an index where it can quickly find those things with that value. So it's kind of like a speed up for that, because when we have these relationships, we could potentially we're going to be searching a lot on those columns. And so it's good to put an index there. Any other questions? Okay, so that's the migration. And then how do we use it? So so this is just some examples of using it, right? So here we load a physician named Bob, and then we can do physician.appointments.length. That's just the normal relationship, the one-to-many. What do we have? That's the Ruby code. So it has appointments, and then we can also do patients right here. So physician.patients.length. We could have also done physician. Well, yeah. So physician patients just loads all the patients for that physician, right? And then we can do physician.appointments.findby. So that's only going to search the appointments that are associated with that physician. And also we can do physician.patients.findby. That's only going to search for the patients that are associated with that physician.
Light out so I can see that better.
Oh, turn this light off?
Yeah. It's over here by the door.
Okay.
Better.
You have to.
Close the window. We're good?
Yeah.
should have been there.
So should have had that from the beginning.
It's pretty incredible.
All right, so you had a question?
Oh, I just was having a hard time following because I could barely see the
Oh, the
stuff on there.
Okay. Yeah, so then, so yeah, we could also create, we could create an appointment on a physician, just like we did before, but now we have to specify the patient ID, right? Because that's one of the things that appointment has. Yeah. So any questions? Let's see. Oh, so one more thing. When we talked about validations, remember that we had the validations like this field is required, maybe like name is required or things like that. So one of the things that that can throw you off is when you add a belongs to author, that automatically, Rails automatically adds a validation for author right here. So if you try to create a book and you don't give it an author, it checks, okay, did you give me an author? No. So then that's an error. Right? So that's a validation check. And so sometimes I think I've seen people that they try to save something without specifying the author, in this case, and you say, oh, it's not saving, and it's just because the model tried to validate that, and then there was an error. Any questions?
Only reason I'm asking this is because I know SQL. What is this comparable to in SQL? Is it like a join?
The validation
No. The
Oh,
belongs to relationship stuff.
Belongs
is,
to-
Is that like a join?
It's defining a foreign key,
It's defined in a foreign key.
defining a foreign key in that table.
yeah, that could be, you can compare it to that. Yeah.
Cool. So I know SQL a little bit better than I know the Rails stuff. So like to me to learn what it's doing in SQL, I'm like, oh, okay, cool.
Yeah. So this is yeah. And then I think one thing that you might try to do is see the SQL that Rails is generating when you use the associations.
Yeah.
Is if you do like book.author,
Mhm.
in the console is going to show like some SQL. And then you can see, oh, okay, that's what it's doing. Sometimes, like for some associations, it does the joins.
Mhm.
And so you can probably kind of better understand it when it does the joins. Any other questions? All right, so then I'm not going to talk about the other ones like the has one or has one through or hasn't belongs to many. They're just not used that as much, but the has one association is just like a one-to-one association. So it would be, the database would look like that. So it's just like a one-to-many relationship in the database, except that we would just be sort of defining that in the books table, each book, there's only one book per author. So one way that you could do that is just have one table, combine both tables, right? And then you wouldn't have the need for an association. But maybe one table you want it to be really, really small so that it loads faster. And then the other table has like data that gets only loaded once in a while. You could think of it, maybe one example could be if you had like a users table and then a user profile table that has a lot of information about a user, like age and where they live, all sorts of things. You don't want to be loading all of that information every time you look at a user. So you could put that in its own table, and then do a has one association, right? So a user has one profile. That's one example. And then the has one through, that's sort of like the has many through, except that again, it's just, in this particular example, it would be one patient corresponds to one physician. So we're just restricting the many part, instead of being many, to be one, right? And that's, see, I think that can be enforced in the database, but we're more concerned with enforcing it in Rails, on the Rails side, and that's what the relationship definitions are doing. Yeah, any questions? Okay, so yeah, like I said, I would encourage you a lot to read through this active record associations reference. I think we kind of have the language, that you should be able, I think you should be able to understand most of it. When we were first beginning, we kind of didn't really have the language for you to go through this and read it, but now I think you should. And so you can see that some of the diagrams I got from here. And then chapter 4 is where like it really goes into detail about everything, like really into detail. So for example, when you write a belongs to, it adds these methods to your model. So here, association means the name of the association. So if we did belongs to author, then it would add the method author to your book. It would also add a method author equals. So you can do like book.author equals, and then an author object. Build association. So this would be the method build author. Create association, create author. And so it adds all these methods. Build, I think, is just, it's kind of like create. It just doesn't save it to the database. And then we have create, create without an exclamation mark, and then create with an exclamation mark. I think create runs the validations, and then create with an exclamation mark, I think it doesn't do the validations. Right, so then you have okay, so here's an example with author. These are all the methods that get added to the book model. Reload author, that just means that we're reloading the data from the database, right? Because what could happen is that you load the data from the database, but somebody else changes the data in the database, and so you might want to reload it at some point. Right, but yeah, I would really encourage you to read all this. Then these are sort of the extra stuff that we can kind of modify the association. Typically, we just write belongs to and then the name of the other table. But here's like the example that you gave, dependent destroyed. And these are all the things that you can add there to your association. So give you some examples of some interesting ones. Like for example, touch means that if you save book, then it's going to try to also save author. And so that's useful sometimes when you're doing, like if you have timestamps on your models, that's what it's updating. So sometimes it's just useful to know like, oh, this author was updated, and it's not necessarily because any of the columns in the author were updated, but it's because maybe one of the books of that author was updated. And then like class name, by default, Rails says, oh, belongs to author. There must be a class called author, but you can override that, what that class is, by doing class name. So you could have belongs to creator, but that creator can refer to the class author, for example.
I was trying to think of the use case for it.
Yeah, it might be. Yeah, I can't think of a use case right now, but the one where it comes up more often is in the other one that has many. Let's see. Yeah, sort of like a self-referential thing, or maybe like the thing you did that where a user can follow people, or
Yeah, the user can follow people and people can follow the user like Twitter.
yeah. So then I can't think of the exact example for that right now, but yeah, this is how you would override the default way that the association behaves. You can override that. Yeah. Any questions?
What does that top part mean? Author where active true dependency is true.
Oh, this one right here. Oh, this is just chaining several things. So, for example, let's see. So by default, when if you had just belongs to author, Rails is gonna run a query, and that query is gonna be something like where author ID equals. Where author ID equals, or no, it's gonna run a query on the author class, and it's gonna say author where author ID is equal to this book's author ID, right? But you might want to modify how that query works. So in this particular case, what they're doing is that they're adding that it also has that author also has to have the active column set to true. So not only does the author ID have to equal not only does the author ID column have to equal the author ID column on the book, but also the active column on the author has to equal true. And so that's this part right here. So we're passing like a where to that query that was being done. And then this dependent destroy, that's also when we destroy the book, we're going to destroy the author. Yeah. And there's a lot of little modifiers, and there's many different ways of doing something that you might want to do. So I periodically try to read some of this documentation, even if I'm not particularly working on a project, but kind of just to know what's possible, right? So if you read the documentation, like, oh, okay, that's kind of possible. Then you go away and you're not going to remember the details of how it works. But what you can take away from reading this is you can take away what's possible, like what can you do? And maybe at some point you come across a problem and you could say like, oh, I kind of remember that there's something that does something similar to this. So let me go look at the documentation and see, how I could do it with what I have. These are kind of like if you have Legos, these are kind of like the different Lego pieces that you can use to build your Lego set. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so just try to read this documentation, to see what's available. see what's possible. If you have any questions, you can just put them up on Slack as well. And we'll try to keep the discussion going about relationships, make sure that everyone's growing, learning more about relationships and that kind of thing.
Where should we put the questions? Like which room in Slack?
I would just put them on the interns, because like if Crystal or some of the other advanced interns see it and they could answer them. Yeah. Cool. I think that's it.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you.